that. So, is it the case that oligarchs and criminals own far more of Britain than we realise? Or is it that when dealing with wealthy investors, we pay lip service to this issue of dirty cash without really doing much about it? To talk more about this, I am joined by former military intelligence officer Philip Ingram. Thank you, Philip. This exclusive by the newspaper about this alleged Russian-owned flat that overlooks MI6, that's just across the water. How surprised were you by that?
Well, it's just beside the building. I'm not very surprised. It's been a standing joke for years that the Russians and Chinese have owned apartments and the buildings right beside MI6 headquarters. And of course, just across the river, we have the sister organization MI5 and the Russian TV channel RT had a complete couple of floors on the building that overlooks that. And all the mobile phone masts that connect all of them together are on top of that building.
And in terms of what somebody could feasibly do in terms of collecting information, if they were wanting to do that, if they were viewing the comings and goings of MI6 on a daily basis, what could they achieve?
Oh, they could achieve an awful lot, and they almost certainly will have been doing that. The things that they can do is they can set up physical surveillance so that they can photograph everyone that's going into the MI6 building or coming out of the MI6 building, anyone that's walking around the outside, and build that picture up over a number of months, years even, and that'll give them an indication, an imagery of people who are working inside the building. The other thing is they'll carry out electronic surveillance, so they'll understand what emissions are coming from the building. The Wi-Fi that leaks out. They'll understand as people leave the building and you're not allowed your mobile phone inside. So what do you do as soon as you get out? Most people naturally switch their device on. They'll be able to pick up those details and potentially identify the telephone numbers of people that are working inside the building or contractors that are going inside the building. And it all helps target other intelligence assets that are looking at it. But MI6 are well aware of this and will have taken a lot of precautionary measures to make sure that what can be collected is kept to an absolute minimum.
Yeah, you would hope MI6 would be aware of the threats very much on their doorstep, perhaps have been aware for a long time. And it must be said at this point, we don't know if it's a threat. This is reporting, again, that's been done by the newspaper. They have found connections that it is a Russian owner. It's very hard to actually identify the origins of who is the owner. We don't know that. We can't report that name at this time. And of course, not all Russians are up to malign practices here in the UK. We're going to have a wider discussion shortly with our next guest about Russian ownership of UK assets. But just on the intelligence side of things, the government, Philip, regularly warns about the threat that Russia poses here to the UK and with spies operating. Currently, the war is still going on. I mean, how concerned are you that we're not taking things seriously enough?
Well, I'm concerned that we're not taking things seriously enough because the threat is huge. It's massive. However, the government is doing quite a lot, as are the agencies. We just don't hear about it. There's a new National Security Act came in the summer, and elements of that have just gone live this month. That has replaced the old Official Secrets Acts, which the last update on that was 1939. So it shows all the governments between 1939 and today have been complacent in looking after our national security. So this new Security Act is giving greater powers to be able to stop the activities of agencies that are carrying out espionage in our country. And MI5, who are responsible for counterintelligence operations in the UK, have realised post the Sergei Skripal attack in Salisbury with Novichok the need to get back into that game again, because they'd switched their effort primarily to counterterrorism, and they now realise that they have to balance in that. And there's been quite a large number of successes in disrupting Russian and other hostile country intelligence operations going on inside the UK. So they're becoming more proactive. We just won't hear about it all.
Former military intelligence officer Philip Ingram, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, for another perspective on this, let's now go to Keir Giles, who's a senior consulting fellow on Russia at think tank Chatham House. Keir, thank you. And I'll start quite simply. The same question I gave to Philip, which was when you saw this exclusive reporting today, were you surprised?
Well, no, absolutely. As Philip said, this is a risk which will have been taken into account by the people who run that building. And in fact, if you read further in the Eye's reporting, it's very clear that this is something against which countermeasures have already been taken. So no surprise that this is recognized as an issue, no surprise that it's dealt with as a potential threat. But the other point, of course, is it's worth stressing that not all Russian money is necessarily dirty money working for the Russian state. It has been possible for some time now to actually make a more or less legitimate pile of cash in Russia and then invested abroad. We're quite a long way on from the robber baron capitalist days of the early oligarchs within Russia, but we're still dealing with the consequences of London being such an open and welcoming environment for dirty money with so few questions asked because it made so many people in the capital so wealthy.
Yeah, I think that's very succinctly put. You can't just say that, it's because a building is owned by the Chinese or by the Russians, in inverted quotes, that it is necessarily a bad thing. People come from those countries. Some are refugees almost. But of course, there are, bad actors, and there is dirty money that makes its way in. In terms of the way the government has been trying to clean up the practice of having dirty money fueled in here, especially after the imposition of sanctions at the onset of the recent war in Ukraine, do you think they've made much progress?
Sadly, not a great deal, partly because sanctions are a very blunt instrument. And of course, who they capture and whether those people actually have any influence on Russian government policy is sometimes open questions. But also, of course, there are so many vested interests within the capital that actually protect that money, because all of the peripheral industries that have benefited from it, not just the bankers who salt the cash away, but also the security firms that look after the wealthy Russians, the estate agents, the lawyers, all of these have their interests in actually maintaining the current situation. Now, Philip Ingram mentioned just a moment ago the national security law, the new one that's come into force in the UK, which by coincidence actually came into force today. That's going to change the environment for people who are trying to harm British national security, not just the foreign interests, but also those who work for them among our own people, but only if it's actually resourced, only if the government does in fact have an interest in making sure that there are investigations and prosecutions under it. Otherwise, it will go the way of the unexplained wealth orders that you mentioned earlier, the way in which the government set up a legal mechanism for looking into the sources of unexplained cash and challenging where it came from if there were suspicions about it. There have been very few prosecutions under that, and not all of them have succeeded. So we have to hope that now there'll be a greater will to actually look into this problem.
What makes the UK just so attractive to wealthy Russians?
There are so many different factors, and some of the most surprising Russians actually park their money and also their families in the UK for reasons which sometimes aren't immediately obvious. You have some of the most vitriolic propagandists on Russian TV sending their children to be educated at British boarding schools and making sure that their fortune is safe out of the hands of the Kremlin by parking it actually in the UK. But a lot of it, of course, is the open environment, the way in which it was so easy to move money in, not just into the UK itself, but also into the offshore tax havens where there were even fewer questions asked about where the money actually came from. So if you made a pile of money through some dodgy, illegitimate means in Russia, and you wanted to put it somewhere safe where it continue earning for you and nobody else could get their hands on it, then this was a very welcoming environment.
In terms of the way those professional services companies, you already mentioned, for example, the security firms, but we're also talking here about lawyers, bankers as well, people who kind of have created an industry around these people, these arrivals in our country. Do you think it's in their interest to try and stop the cleanup of dirty money in the UK?
That depends entirely on the conscience and the moral compass and the scruples of those individual lawyers. If you are unscrupulous and you have no conscience, it's very easy to make a substantial amount of money off the back of protecting Russian dirty money. You mentioned the lawsuit against Elliot Higgins of the Bellingcat agency by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, claiming that he wasn't head of Wagner. That was actually facilitated by sanctions exemptions for Prigozhin so that he could finance one of these law firms, which I'm glad to say has now ceased practicing, to conduct this obviously fraudulent lawsuit. So as long as there are people who are willing to suspend all of their moral obligations to do the right thing in their profession, there will always be a ready market for these services for Russians.
Keir Giles, Russia expert, Chatham House. Never not interesting talking to you. Thank you.